So now I'm happy to welcome Steve Hindy, who just so happens to be our 2020 Cornell Entrepreneur of the Year. Woohoo! And the co-founder of Brooklyn Brewery. Steve is definitely a craft beer connoisseur. And today he's going to share some thoughts on the industry. So welcome, Steve, and welcome back, Scott, who's going to be moderating. I will jump off and come back in a little bit for some Q&A. Or actually, I'll pop in when I have some good questions to ask.
Pop in whenever you want, Zach. And
All
Steve,
right.
thanks for joining us. This is awesome. I'm a fan. So, and you know, at first I was going to say if it weren't 2:30 in the afternoon, I'd probably have one of your products in my hand. But then I realized in COVID, like who's counting, right? I mean,
exactly. It's Friday.
So yeah, it's really a pleasure to be with you. Congratulations again, 2020 Cornell Entrepreneur of the Year. I mean, I have grown up throughout college, going to all these celebrations of Cornell Entrepreneur of the Year and looking up to folks like yourselves and what you've done. So thank you. Thank you for joining us. I know you've joined Zach in the past and talked about your early career in journalism and then your subsequent entrepreneurial journey to founding the Brooklyn Brewery. I guess today, maybe we'll turn the focus to the craft beer industry itself and learn a little bit. Is that okay with you?
Yeah, of course.
Great. So in your book, The Craft Beer Revolution, you write that there were fewer than 50 brewing companies, if I'm not mistaken, in the United States when you started Brooklyn Brewery in the mid 80s. And today there are more than 8,000 breweries. This is, I think, 150x where we were then. How did this happen?
Well, it's the title of my book is The Craft Beer Revolution. And we really have created a revolution in the beer industry. We've explored traditional brewing styles, we've created new styles, and we've really elevated beer in the culinary and beverage world. And I'm very proud of that. And it has found its way into thousands of communities across the United States. These are all small businesses, most of them very small, and all of them very much committed to their communities and being a positive part of their communities. So it's really a great group of entrepreneurs in virtually every town of any size in America now.
And so the COVID-19 pandemic just really flipped the U.S. economy upside down. What kind of impact has it had on the industry as a whole?
It's a killer. It's a big threat to the viability of thousands of those small breweries. You know, of the 8,000 breweries, about 70% are brewery restaurants or breweries that depend on their tasting room, their retail space, for most of their revenue. And obviously, they have been devastated by the shutdowns that have happened all across the country. And going into this winter, it's really touch and go for thousands of those small businesses. At the beginning of the pandemic, our association, the Brewers Association, did a survey of our members. We have about between 5,000 and 6,000 of the breweries are members of our trade association. At that time, 40% said they were threatened by the shutdowns that were happening. We did another survey in about July, and that had shrunk to 20%. So people were more optimistic because I think 80% of craft breweries got PPP funding, and that really got them through, you know, the tough times of the shutdown. But now, heading into this winter, with the surge in coronavirus cases and deaths, we're faced with what could be an even more devastating shutdown. And all those little businesses, many of them mom and pop kind of operations, are threatened.
So I was going to ask you what the biggest challenge facing craft brewers today is, and clearly it's what you just went through. It's their reliance on these tasting rooms associating with restaurants and the potential impending shutdown. Do you see any advantages, not from COVID clearly, but just from the modern, direct to consumer model of brands building relationships and new technology? Are there any other tailwinds, if you will, for craft brewers aside from the giant headwind that they're dealing with right now?
Yeah, a lot of local governments have eased the restrictions on brewers selling directly to consumers during this period, targeting those tasting room breweries that depend mostly on selling direct to consumers. However, there are great forces that oppose that relaxation of the sales direct to consumers by breweries, chiefly distributors who are very powerful in every state politically, and very much out to protect their middleman part of the business. And so there's a battle going on right now in virtually every state in the country between small brewers and distributors over making those direct-to-consumer privileges permanent. And without that, it's going to be very difficult for a lot of these small breweries to make it through the winter.
It's I imagine that a lot of these are very, very small businesses, and then of course you have the behemoths, the non-craft, like large conglomerate, and a lot of those probably have they either own the distributors or have relationships with the big distributors. So it seems like you find yourself, you're one of the larger of the craft. So do they see you as kind of a bit of a leader of the clan, if you will? Like what's your role being the largest of the craft in terms of navigating these difficult times?
I think one reason why craft brewing has flourished is because of our trade association and our sticking together. Obviously, there are some big differences between the interests of the bigger craft breweries and the small craft breweries. But if we don't stick together in these fights in state houses all across the country and in Washington, we don't get anything done. And so I think that force, political force of the 8,000 small businesses who have, very faithful followings in all their communities, that is a big reason why craft brewing has been as successful as it has over the last 4 decades.
So here's a question just on the international opportunity that I know you're one of the bigger or biggest exporters of American craft beer, if I'm not mistaken. What made that happen? Was it a purposeful strategy or?
No, it wasn't. I mean, our original business plan had us getting 10% of the Brooklyn market. As you know, Brooklyn's a very big place, like 2.6 or 7 million people. And that was our original goal. I mean, it didn't take long for us to realize we better start selling beer in Manhattan also, because actually they drink a lot more beer over there than they do in Brooklyn. But from the beginning, we had foreigners coming to us and expressing interest in exporting our beer. And for us, we were kind of baffled. Like the first foreigner to come to see us was like in the first couple of months of the business, and it was a Japanese oil company executive who came over in a limo in a suit and tie, and we're in this dumpy warehouse in a rundown part of Brooklyn. And he says, I love what you're doing. I love this, the looks of this beer. The beer is very different than anything we have in Japan. I want to export this. What do you know about beer? Well, I don't know anything, but I know people in Japan who do. And anyway, he was our first exporter to Japan. And for us, it was like, are you crazy? You know, I'm having trouble selling it in Brooklyn, you know? You're going to try and sell it in Tokyo. But that was the beginning of something that 30 years later, the Kirin Brewery in Japan, one of the biggest breweries in Asia, invested in us and now distributes our beer in Japan. So Japan and Asia in general is a big market for us.
Wow.
We had similar kind of connections to Europe. And it was also unschooled, inexperienced people. There was a very wealthy woman in France. There was some crazy guy in Italy. There were numerous people in the UK who wanted to, you know, they were fascinated by the name Brooklyn. So they wanted to bring this beer there. And eventually the Carlsberg Brewery, which is among the biggest brewing conglomerates in the world, became our distributor in Europe. So suddenly we had entree in Europe and in Asia with big time distribution. And that really, you know, helped propel us to places we never imagined. But it really, it wasn't like those big companies made it happen. They saw what these little companies were doing and they jumped into it wisely, I think.
Interesting.
Yeah, Scott, can I jump in with a question from the
Sure,
audience?
Zach, go ahead.
So this relates to a little bit about what you just said, Steve. And by the way, it's interesting to know, because I've heard it from you before, that the CEO of Kirin Brewery is also a Cornellian.
That's right, he is.
Is that
And
right? So I'm
he
not
and
sure
I
that
taught
helped
a
or not.
class at the business school a couple of years ago. He was thrilled, I was thrilled.
That's great. Okay, so the question is, do you see the same distributor middleman obstacles in the microbrewery industry as well, or micro distilling industry? And how do you break that wheel and get directly to the market?
You know, I think in distilling it's even tougher because the liquor distribution is much more consolidated than beer distribution. It's happening in beer too, but if you're a liquor brand, you basically, if you're lucky, have two choices in any given market. And so because of that, there are a lot of small companies trying to develop distribution businesses in liquor, but it's a very tough go in liquor and in beer. I think given the glut of brands on the market in the beer business, distributors who 10 years ago wanted every craft brand they could get their hands on. Now they're weeding out the ones that are not moving, and they're dropping brands. And so it's much tougher to get big time distribution now than it was 10 years ago. And I think that's even worse during the pandemic, because I know our distributors have really put the squeeze on us to limit the brands that we're selling through the distributors, because they've had to become leaner and more focused in their businesses, and it's had an impact on us. And that makes it virtually impossible for startup tasting room kind of breweries to be able to break out of that into a bigger market.
That's interesting. Scott, one more question, then I'll flip it back to you. Do you think that there might be a wave of consolidation among the small micro brews that are facing all this pressure because of COVID?
You know, we invested in a brewery in San Francisco, a 21st Amendment, and one in Colorado called Funkworks. And we tried to combine our distribution resources and share a distribution platform nationally so that, you know, each of us didn't have to have like 70 salespeople working on chain stores. We could have one group of 70 working for all three. And that was off to a pretty strong start until the pandemic. And then the whole thing kind of collapsed. There are several companies that have consolidated different breweries together, but I can't say that that's happening in a big way. There are kind of isolated cases where that has worked.
It's interesting. Okay, Scott, go back to our question.
Yeah, well, I had another question. You know, as a design obsessive, I just was wondering if you could just share a bit of the story around the company logo. I know it was designed by the late Milton Glaser, who created that legendary "I Love New York" logo and many other iconic designs. So how did you get Milton Glaser, you know, in your venture? What was it like working with him? I just would love to hear a quick snippet on that.
Well, it was a gift to be able to work with Milton for 30 years. He's an incredibly generous and wise man, and of course, a genius designer. In the beginning of the company, I started out trying to develop this idea of a Brooklyn branded beer. And I wanted to call it Brooklyn Eagle Beer, after the Brooklyn Eagle newspaper in Brooklyn, a great newspaper once edited by Walt Whitman, because of my newspaper background, basically. And so I started out talking to artists I knew and got kind of frustrated. They all wanted to do it. They all thought it was a great idea. And I started talking to small design firms, and I was shocked at what it cost to get a corporate logo. It was like $40,000 minimum. And I interviewed about 30 different design firms. I was working in a newspaper at the time, but I had my mornings free. So I interviewed these design, and I got very frustrated by the whole thing. My wife heard me wringing my hands one night over this and said, "Why don't you call the best in New York? You know, you're a journalist, you don't mind cold calling anybody." So I called all these top designers and got meetings with Chermayeff and Geismar, Pentagram, some others. But when I called Milton Glaser's office, the woman answered the phone and said, "Do you know who Milton is?" And I said, "Well, yeah, I hear he's pretty good. I want to talk to him." She said, "Well, he doesn't just talk to anyone who calls here." So she blew me off, and it brought out the journalist in me. I started bugging her every day. And eventually she said, "You're not going to give up, are you?" I said, "No." She said, "Okay, here's Milton." Puts Milton on, tell him about the idea. He says, "That sounds great. You know, come and see me." And the first thing he said when we sat down to work on the project, obviously we chose him out of all these. Milton said, "Look, we got Brooklyn here. Brooklyn is kind of an undervalued kind of place. Nobody is claiming Brooklyn. Let's claim Brooklyn and forget the eagle, ditch the bird. You know, let's just call it Brooklyn Brewery, Brooklyn beer. It fits." And then he unveiled that logo about a week later, and I looked at the logo.
You pushed back at all at that point, or were you okay with changing your idea so suddenly?
Are you kidding? I'm listening to Milton Glaser. You know, I would follow him anywhere. But he unveiled the logo, and I said, "That's it?" And he said, "Look, don't say a word. Take it home, put it on your kitchen table, show it to your wife. Don't show it to a lot of people. Live with it a little. And I did, and eventually the beauty of that simple B began to sink in, and how it kind of evoked, the sports history of Brooklyn without being a smarmy, kind of nostalgia piece. And that logo has really taken us around the world, and the word Brooklyn. All of our competitors, Sam Adams, Sierra Nevada, Anchor, they've all been exporting, many of them longer than we have, but we're the biggest exporter. And I think we owe it to the name Brooklyn and to Milton.
It's great. I mean, sometimes the genius of the designer is his or her just vast experience and instincts, and sometimes that's the gravity that helps convince the entrepreneur to make a tough change. I just real quickly, I remember a crazy story about the late designer Paul Rand, who's in the same caliber as Milton Glaser and developed the IBM logo and all these famous logos. And Steve Jobs hired him to do the brand for Apple. And apparently they negotiated for months over what it would actually cost. And ultimately, they agreed on a price, and they went on a walk together. And Paul Rand took out a sketch pad and drew the Apple logo and handed it to Steve. And he said, "What the hell? Like, you did that in 15 seconds. It's like, I was going to pay you $150,000. It's 15 seconds of work." And he looked at him. He's like, "No, Steve, it took me 30 years.
Yeah.
Right? It's like the gravity.
I've had similar discussions with Milton, because the better I got to know him, the more open he was with me. And I would see him take a call from someone about an idea and sit down with his sketchbook and have the answer within 30 minutes.
Right.
And I remember saying to him once, "Milton, you just churn these things." He said, "Well, Jesus, I've been doing this for 50 years. You'd think I'd learned something along the way."
Right, exactly.
That's great. That's great. Scott, a lot of people are asking about the seltzer market. And I know it's something that was interesting to Steve. So Steve,
Yeah.
give us your views on the seltzer market, whether it's good or bad for craft or not. Love to hear your insights.
Whether it's good or bad for craft doesn't matter. It's people are demanding it, and it's pulling all the bigger craft brewers into that market. I don't like it personally. To me, it's the kind of presentation of alcohol that is mostly about getting drunk, and I see many of the producers suddenly going to 8% versions, which is stronger than malt liquor, which is the kind of crap we drank when we were undergrads at Cornell. So I can understand the appeal of it to younger people, is Brooklyn Brewery going to get into it? Yes, but it's not my favorite beverage, nor will it ever be. I don't think.
It sounds like the founder is doing a little kicking and screaming on that one.
Yeah. But I get it. I mean, kids today, they grew up with craft beer. They didn't grow up with Bud Light and having no choices. And so craft beer is kind of old hat to them. And I think they're just looking to have fun, and they don't want to be preached to about IPAs or hops or whatever.
Right.
Just, let me drink a few of these easy drinking things, and it's Friday night, so whatever.
Right. By the way, somebody posted in the chat that they had a Brooklyn brew in Guatemala, so they were very thankful that you had distribution there.
Guatemala, yeah, that's a crazy guy, an American, who I forget the name of the town where he is, but he has sent me pictures of mules with Brooklyn beer packed on the mule going into certain parts of Guatemala.
It's called distribution.
Yeah.
A lot of other questions on the chat are about non-alcoholic beer. I know that you have one.
Yeah.
Like to hear your thoughts on that as well. And
Well,
maybe also also talk about CBD infused brews, if you think they're coming along too.
Yeah, we have a beer called Brooklyn Special Effects, and it's alcohol-free beer, and it's incredible success in Europe and now in the US, where we've introduced it. We'll be coming out with an IPA version of Special Effects in the next couple of months. That's a great brand, and it tastes good, unlike most no alcohol beers that I've had in the past. So very, very excited about that.
And how about CBD? Do you think it's a viable infusion eventually?
One of my partners is working on that. I think that we haven't been able to develop anything that tastes good with CBD. But yeah, that's in the works, and I don't know where that's going to go.
Okay.
Yeah.
Excellent. Scott, we have time for a couple more. Hope you're on mute.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. One other question I love asking entrepreneurs who also write or have a background in writing is what role, I mean, do you feel writing has played for you in the craft brew journey? And you know, you were a journalist. How has that prepared you for life as an entrepreneur?
You know, I think writing is one of the most important skills anyone can develop. Because if you know how to write, you know how to organize thoughts in your mind and put them on paper. And once they're on paper, I think you become better at speaking about those issues. And so being able to conceptualize, to look at a situation and come up with the right approach to it, I think all has to do with the kind of organization your mind does when it writes. And so I think writing is critical. For me, as an entrepreneur, you know, public relations, free press was critical to our marketing. And as a journalist, you know, your objective is to write good stories that get on the front page. As a brewer, your objective is to tell good stories that someone will want to put on the front page. And so I think also journalists are very enterprising. Journalists are always looking for something new, some new angle on things. And I think that helps in business too, to be on your toes, to be thinking always, questioning what you're doing. Are you doing the right thing today? Should you be doing something else? That's all the kind of organization that I think a good journalist does day in, day out. What is this story? You know, I'm here at this place with all these other hacks. You know, what's the story I should tell that these guys are not going to see?
Perfect.
Well said. Couldn't agree more. Zach?
Well, Steve, so we're at our time, but we've been trying to ask the same question to all the speakers. So we're going to ask you one more, which is, if you could have done it differently, would you have done anything differently?
You know, there were a couple of mistakes we made along the way that were expensive. So I definitely would have more firmly opposed a project we had during the .com years in late 90s called totalbeer.com, where we tried to go direct to consumers in New York City with all the brands we were brewing and distributing. And that was way before its time. That function is performed now by Fresh Direct and Amazon. But obviously, they're doing more than just beer. We were just focused on beer.
Right.
So otherwise, I think we've been very fortunate over the years. The relationship with Milton was so important because he guided us not only in design and in branding, but he knows a lot about New York and about business, and that was critical for us.
Yep, absolutely. This has been fantastic, Steve. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Steve, so much.
Thank you, Zach Scott. Great event today. I really enjoyed that blockchain guy.
Yeah, he's outstanding.
Where's he from?
He's from Turkey, but he's a Cornell. But he's been at Cornell for a long time, and he just recently, well, 2 years ago, took a leave from Cornell to start his company.
That was fascinating.
Yeah, maybe he'll find a way to distribute beer tokens.
I think the Cornell Endowment should buy some of his AVAX tokens, but that's another conversation.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, thanks, Steve.
Thanks.
Thanks, Steve.